Donald Trump didn't just lose an argument. He may have just lost the most strategically important energy partnership in North America, not with a handshake, not with a treaty, but with a speech. On March 17, 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before Parliament in Ottawa and did something no modern Canadian leader has ever dared to do. He declared energy independence from the United States, not as a threat, not as a negotiation tactic. He spoke in the past tense: done, effective, structural. And here's what makes this explosive. Washington wasn't warned, no advance copy of the speech, no diplomatic courtesy call, no quiet back channel to the US Embassy. It was a deliberate blackout. A message: Canada was finished asking permission before making sovereign decisions about Canadian resources. Carney unveiled what he called the Sovereign Energy Declaration of 2026, a 7-point framework designed to permanently restructure where Canadian oil, natural gas, hydroelectric power, and critical minerals go, and more importantly, who does not get to assume automatic access anymore. For decades, the United States has been Canada's default customer. That era, Carney signaled, is over. This is not a routine trade dispute. This is not a tariff spat. Canada supplies roughly 60% of US crude oil imports. Millions of American homes in the Northeast and Midwest depend on Canadian natural gas. States like New York, Vermont, Maine, and Minnesota rely on long-term hydroelectric contracts from north of the border. And the country President Trump has repeatedly suggested could become the 51st state just announced it is building an energy future that does not revolve around Washington. Markets understood immediately. When a prime minister says independents and energy traders in New York, London, and Tokyo start moving billions within minutes, that's not political theater. That's structural realignment. Tensions had been building for weeks. Since February, President Trump had floated the idea that America could replace Canadian energy if it had to. In Washington, that may have sounded like leverage. In Ottawa, it sounded like a warning shot, because while replacing Canadian supply quickly is logistically unrealistic, the signal mattered. The White House viewed energy not as mutual interdependence, but as a pressure tool. And that was the turning point. According to multiple reports, a March 12th White House economic briefing outlined scenarios where alternative energy infrastructure investments could be used as long-term negotiating leverage against Canada. Once word of that discussion reached senior officials in Ottawa, one Canadian source described it as a clarifying moment. If Washington was willing to weaponize energy supply chains, then Canada would make sure no single buyer, including the United States, ever held that kind of leverage again. So on March 17, Carney pulled the trigger. And what he announced next wasn't symbolic. It was surgical. It was sequenced. It was designed to hit American industry, American utilities, and American politics exactly where they are most exposed. And when Trump responded just hours later, everything escalated. What Carney rolled out was not a press release. It was a blueprint, 7 coordinated policy strikes, each one engineered to reduce American leverage and expand Canada's global reach. And the sequencing, deliberate, strategic, designed to trigger immediate reaction inside the United States before the White House could even organize its talking points. First came the resurrection of the Energy East Pipeline Corridor, a project shelved back in 2017. Carney didn't propose reviving it. He fast-tracked it. Federal regulatory acceleration, an initial commitment of 14.7 billion Canadian dollars. The goal is simple and powerful. Move Alberta crude east to St. John, New Brunswick, directly to Atlantic tidewater, where it can be shipped to Europe and Asia without touching American territory. no U.S. transit, no U.S. bottleneck, no U.S. pressure point. Midwest refiners who rely heavily on Alberta heavy crude felt that instantly because geography has always been America's quiet advantage. Canadian oil flowed south because it was easiest. If that oil now flows east to global markets, American refiners lose pricing power they've enjoyed for decades. That's not theory, that's math. Then came the second strike, a formal energy framework agreement with the European Union quietly signed in Brussels on March 15th, but embargoed until this moment. Germany, the Netherlands, France, a guaranteed 12 billion cubic meters of Canadian LNG annually by 2031, routed through a new terminal in Goldboro, Nova Scotia. Europe has been desperate to diversify away from Russian gas since 2022. Canada had hesitated for years to commit the capital. That hesitation is over. 4 seconds of silence reportedly filled the House of Commons after that announcement because everyone understood what it meant. This wasn't Canada exploring options. This was Canada locking in alternative buyers. The third move hit closer to home for Americans. Carney announced the suspension and review of preferential pricing arrangements for hydroelectric exports to northeastern U.S. states, New York, Vermont, Maine, Minnesota. For decades, those states benefited from long-term contracts delivering low-cost, reliable Canadian power below domestic generation costs. Under the new framework, those contracts will be renegotiated at market rates. New capacity will prioritize Canadian industry first, international buyers second. American state utilities, they now bid competitively. Governors learned about it through their energy departments before Carney finished speaking, and the phone lines lit up. The fourth point, raised eyebrows in Washington's defense corridors. The creation of a Canadian critical minerals sovereignty reserve, lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements. Export permits can now be reviewed or restricted if Ottawa determines Canadian economic interests are at risk. These materials are not decorative. They are foundational electric vehicles, advanced weapon systems, semiconductors, Terry electronics. Defense contractors didn't need a translator to understand that message. Then came the Indo-Pacific pivot. Bilateral LNG supply agreements with Japan and South Korea, 2 of the world's largest importers, anchored through Pacific-facing infrastructure in British Columbia, negotiated quietly since late 2025, unveiled. Now, as part of the broader declaration, Canada wasn't just redirecting energy away from the U.S. It was tying new energy relationships to America's own strategic allies using the same resources Washington may have assumed would remain indefinitely captive to the continental market. The final 2 points focused on internal restructuring, provincial coordination, domestic market reforms, ensuring the shift is institutional, not emotional. This isn't a temporary flare-up, it's architecture. And markets responded immediately. Canadian energy stocks surged. Alberta oil sands companies jumped between 6 and 9% on the Toronto Stock Exchange. LNG infrastructure firms spiked. Provincial energy ministers from British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec publicly endorsed the framework within the hour. Here's the uncomfortable question. If this were symbolic posturing, would markets have treated it like a growth story? History offers a chilling parallel. In 1973, OPEC imposed an oil embargo on the United States during the Yom Kippur War. Gas lines, price spikes, economic shock. But Canada is not imposing an embargo. It's doing something arguably more consequential, building permanent alternatives, pipelines that once built do not disappear, LNG terminals that once operational do not close because political temperatures cool. This is not a 5-month disruption. This is a generational recalibration. And if you think Washington hasn't noticed, wait until you hear how President Trump responded and how the markets reacted to him. At 2:34 p.m. on March 17th, President Trump fired back. On Truth Social, he wrote, "Canada just made the biggest mistake in their history. We don't need their energy. I will impose immediate 50% tariffs on all Canadian energy products effective in 30 days unless this ridiculous declaration is reversed. America first, always." Strong words, red meat for supporters, a show of force. 12 minutes later, the White House confirmed the Department of Energy and the U.S. Trade Representative were preparing tariff instruments on Canadian crude, natural gas, and hydroelectric imports. But here's where reality intruded. Energy markets didn't cheer. They flinched. Within the first hour, U.S. natural gas futures spiked 5.7%. Heating oil moved sharply higher. Utility stocks in the Northeast, companies serving customers who depend heavily on Canadian supply, fell between 3 and 7%. Why? Because tariffs don't magically create replacement pipelines. They don't build LNG terminals in 30 days. They don't reroute molecules already flowing through integrated infrastructure built over half a century. A 50% tariff on Canadian energy doesn't end dependence. It raises prices for American families and manufacturers immediately, and that's the bind. Follow through on the tariff threat. Home heating costs rise in New York, Vermont, Maine, Pennsylvania. Industrial energy costs rise across the Midwest. Inflationary pressure returns in states that are politically competitive. Back down, the threat looks hollow, leverage erodes. Every foreign capital takes note. Even the American Petroleum Institute stopped short of endorsing the tariff, instead calling for urgent bilateral negotiations. And within days, governors from New York, Vermont, Maine, Minnesota, and Massachusetts from both parties sent a joint letter urging the White House to suspend the tariff plan before it triggers a domestic energy crunch. So the question now isn't just whether Canada can diversify, it's whether Washington can afford the cost of proving it doesn't need Canada when the infrastructure says otherwise. And this is where the strategic vulnerabilities start to get uncomfortable. Let's strip away the rhetoric and look at the exposure. Roughly 4.8 million households across New England and the Mid-Atlantic rely on natural gas that either originates in Canada or moves through Canadian infrastructure. You can chant energy dominance all day long, but if 50% tariffs hit that supply, heating bills rise. Not in theory, on monthly statements, in swing states. Then there's the Midwest. From Minnesota to Ohio, energy-intensive industries, steel, chemicals, automotive, food processing, operate on thin margins tied directly to competitive energy costs. Canadian hydroelectric power and natural gas help stabilize those costs at a 50% tariff, and you don't punish Ottawa. You squeeze American manufacturers competing against Europe and Asia. That's not economic nationalism. That's self-inflicted drag. And the most sensitive layer, critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements. Canada's new sovereignty reserve gives Ottawa regulatory discretion over exports deemed contrary to national interest. Those materials feed electric vehicle batteries, advanced weapon systems, semiconductors, military electronics. Congressional committees have already requested classified briefings. The Pentagon is watching because supply chains don't care about political pride. Energy historian Daniel Yergin described Carney's move as a fundamental restructuring of North American energy architecture. That's not cable news drama. That's structural analysis. Once Atlantic LNG terminals are built, once Pacific export routes to Japan and South Korea are operational, once European contracts are locked in, those are physical facts. Steel in the ground, contracts with penalties, constituencies with jobs on the line. And infrastructure, once built, shapes politics for decades. This is bigger than a 30-day tariff clock. It's about whether pipelines, terminals, and